All right. Hey, good evening, everybody. I want to thank everyone for joining the September CCA Oregon monthly Zoom call. We're excited this evening. We have Heath Heikkila. Heath is our CCA Oregon's fisheries director that's going to be joining us. A lot of meetings we've had over the last couple of months have been focused on tackle guides. So we're really excited to kind of get into the advocacy end of what CCA has been doing. So, hey, Heath, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Wade. With that kind of an intro, we'll put people to sleep to talk policy. But glad you guys were talking about some fun stuff before this. But good, thanks for having me.
Hey, happy to have you. Yeah, a lot going on as far as, it's a good time of year to be a fisherman. If you have a boat, most people are out using them this time of year. Facebook is full of pictures. That's awesome. Chapters have been busy. Our Portland chapter, they had their annual golf event this last Saturday. Haven't heard, is there anybody that's on the call that's from the Portland chapter? I'd love to give an update. All right. And then this coming Saturday, our Columbia River Gorge, they're going to be having their annual event. That's September 16th. It's going to be at the Shiloh Inn in the Dalles. The doors open there at 4:30, dinners at 6. They've got some pretty exciting prizes. I know they've got a Yamaha 9.9 motor that they'll be giving away. They're going to have an edge rod and reel, bird guns. It's a prime rib chicken cordon bleu dinner. So if you're in the area, again, it's a great way to renew your membership. Attending a banquet, the banquet is definitely the lifeblood of our organization. It helps with fundraising, helps with membership. So if you're in that area, please make sure that you are attending their event. So, all right, Ken and Mary, hey, thanks for joining us. With that, let's go ahead and jump in. So, lots of stuff that we can talk about, Heath. Talk with you a little bit beforehand. I'd love to kind of kick off a question for you on, something that we hear regularly is, what is CCA doing? I know that you've been really busy. Could you kind of give us an intro primer and let us know what we should be looking forward to?
Yeah, thanks, Wade, and thanks everyone for joining. Well, it's kind of typical with us. A lot of the same issues, just kind of they've developed and they continue moving forward. So first, I'll mention we came out of the Oregon legislative session. One issue that we're tracking closely and we're going to need to engage in even more moving forward is this budget provision that was added to ODF&W's budget that calls for a third-party assessment of ODF&W's hatchery system. There's the most recent CCA advocacy update in the Oregon newsletter kind of included more details on that, but it essentially calls for an economic cost benefit analysis, calls for an analysis of the effects of hatchery programs on wild fish and how that's considered in federal and state reviews, as well as considerations of climate change and recommendations for potential changes to the hatchery system. It shouldn't come as a surprise. There are organizations that are seeking to shut down more of our hatcheries out there. And I think it's going to be very important that we're involved in this and that we're working with ODF&W to make sure there's appropriate stakeholder involvement. And, the best available science as we're looking here moving forward on the benefits of hatcheries. Certainly, we know that without hatcheries and the mitigation that they provide for habitat impacts, hydro, certainly in the Willamette, we're well aware of that, that there would be no fisheries. And a lot of the pictures you're talking about, people out on fishing doing well right now, a lot of those are hatchery fish, as we know. So we know we can do it right. We can run and manage hatcheries consistent with wild fish recovery, particularly when we use, harvest reform and couple them together. But we think we can do them both right. So that's something we're going to be engaged in, something we are involved in the Oregon legislative session. And then, of course, really Washington has been very involved in the buyback implementation in Washington, where just an immense amount of the gillnet permits were taken out of, that are no longer in place. We're down to just a handful of gillnet licenses that were actually active prior to the buyback. And so we're working hard in Washington that WDFW follow the legislative intent, which rules called for the impacts associated with those gillnet licenses essentially to be reserved for conservation, either in the form of selective fisheries that are able to benefit our wild fish, or through escapement. Certainly that would be the case in a stock like beaver and steelhead, which are caught as bycatch in gillnet fishery. And then, this year has just been really, frankly, disappointing, other than maybe the most recent opportunity here we've had on the Columbia River. Fortunately, we've got a nice return shaping up of fall Chinook, and some catch rates that are really good, and some fisheries right now that are good. But it was a tough spring on the Columbia River and a tough summer, with kind of how things unfolded from a management perspective, with the tribes exceeding their impacts in the spring and resulting in a really early closure of the spring Chinook fishery. Of course, we've talked about how the non-concurrent policies between Oregon and Washington have resulted in very punitive actions to the recreational fishery for spring Chinook, one of the most valuable fisheries on the entire planet. So these are things that we continue working on, trying to get those policies aligned between the two states, and so we see more opportunity there. So there's a couple things. The other big area, Wade, and I want to take a break, take questions, or your thoughts, is really I think we've done a lot to change the regime of management of fisheries on the Columbia River. We're not done. Certainly on the non-tribal side, we have more work to do with the gillnet fishery, including the so-called tangle small mesh gillnet fishery that's going to be running here for the remainder of the fall. But we're really looking more now at ocean fisheries and just what's going on there. I think, as many of you know, there was a legal case challenging the troll fishery in Southeast Alaska, and a bit of back and forth that took place there. Ultimately, an appeals court, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, allowed that fishery to resume after a federal judge in Seattle had blocked it. But what it really does highlight is the very extensive harvest that's taking place of Oregon and Washington salmon populations, and really raises questions about, we've known this for a long time, the sustainability of the harvest levels that we're seeing in primarily non-selective mixed stocks harvests in Alaska off our own coast. And what can we do to get more involved as an organization, kind of taking that next step to get more involved in the council process, for example, Pacific Fisheries Management Council, as well as the North Pacific, and then the various other acronyms that get very involved in this, with the Pacific Salmon Commission and so forth. So that is an area where I see us getting more involved. Right now, NOAA is taking comment on some increased Chinook production that they had approved. It was kind of subject to this litigation I mentioned earlier, and they're taking comment on this. This additional Chinook production was meant to provide additional prey for southern resident killer whales, highly endangered whales that make a home in the Puget Sound and the Salish Sea primarily. And the idea behind it is producing more prey, but we think it's really important. Of course, we support the hatchery production, really, really important. We also need to make sure that we're managing harvest in a way that allows the wild Chinook to get back. So we're making progress towards recovering those stocks, as well as allowing fish to get back to southern Oregon, southern resident killer whales, as well as our inland waters here, where we hope to have some more fishing opportunity for the folks that are bearing a lot of the burden that it comes to recovery and whatnot. So that's kind of a snapshot. We can dig into some of the issues more here, Wade.
All right, thanks for that. Hey, if anyone has any questions I would ask, please just use the emoticon for raising your hand, and then we'll get to you. Hey, Heath, one of the things that you talked about was the gillnet buybacks. I know that we hear, hey, what do we need to do to make that happen in Oregon? Is there anything that you can share in regards, what that future would look like?
Yeah, thanks, Wade. I mean, buybacks can be a good thing if they're done the right way, and that they're not what I call a fleet reduction, which is essentially nothing more than removing the number of licenses and letting the remaining license holders fish the same amount. All that does is make the remaining license holders richer. And that is what WDFW had originally proposed, was a license reduction. The legislature thought differently, and the legislature provided $14.4 million in taxpayer dollars in Washington to not only reduce the number of licenses, but reduce the impact the fishery was having. If we're going to spend taxpayer dollars, we ought to do that. And, the legislature signaled this intent in a budget, which it isn't technically law, it's session law. Last 2 years. So there's been some, frankly, questions about, is WDFW going to honor the intent of the legislature? They say they are. They've done the calculation of what the impacts are, not 100%, so it's implementable. So we're working on that. But I guess to answer the question, we need to make sure that is done right. And as an organization, and I think as sports anglers and as taxpayers, the last thing we want to see is money spent if the agencies aren't going to, if it's not going to be implemented in a way to actually accomplish the goal. Which everyone for years has been talking about, the need to move non-selective gill nets out of the main stem. And here's a golden opportunity to do that, and we need to make sure it is fully implemented. So that is, and frankly, that's as we get into future legislative sessions, that's where we're going to have to make sure that legislators are very clear about the intent of any buyback.
Yeah, thanks for that. Last thing we want to do is to have the same number of fish going to, the gill nets and just put more money in the pocket. And that's not what I think that the goal was with that Washington move. So, hey, another thing that you talked about was the South Alaskan troll concerns and how, we need to take it to that next step, or, that next phase. You mentioned, the commission, one of the things I know that helps make CCA effective is by getting our members involved in those types of organizations, to where we have a voice, to where that we're staying up to date with what some of those issues and discussions would be. How are we doing? I mean, do you know right now kind of how we're doing in representing in those groups, and where maybe some opportunities would exist? What should we be looking to try and get involved with?
Yeah, thanks, Wade. So there, as I mentioned, there's like an alphabet soup of different entities that all have a little hand in the management of the harvest of Pacific salmon, whether you're in Alaska or you're down here. I think the answer to the question, I always like to start at the local level as much as we can. So we've been very involved with both the Washington and Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commissions, which deal really with fisheries in our own inland waters and allocations thereof and so forth. The next step beyond that is the Pacific Fishery Management Council, and that is made up of representatives from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and California, and I think that's the next step for recreational anglers for CCA to certainly engage in. And I'll be honest, just like many councils across the country, and we're not a rarity, they have been controlled largely by commercial interests, and if there are recreational folks that are involved, a lot of times it's the charter side of the envelope, which sometimes thinks a little more like the commercial side, and that gets into a whole nother set of topics. But certainly as an organization, CCA has been very versed with getting people onto councils. So for example, right now, or most recently, the chair of BFMC has been Mark Thornlink, who's actually a CCA California member, an avid recreational angler. So it can be done. I guess what I'd say to the viewers right now is it can take a while to work your way up the proverbial, steps of the ladder in fishery policy to get on one of those councils. It's getting on the Salmon Advisory Subcommittee of the council, doing that work. So if there are folks that are willing to invest some time, they will be supported by our organization, by us. That we'd certainly love to see that, because it really does take building a bench, so to speak, of people that could fill those seats in the future.
No, couldn't agree more. Thanks. It's the fall. So now we're seeing some of the gill nets going into the main stem of the Columbia. People see the nets there. What is CCA doing? The nets are still in the river. Not realizing again that, we haven't had them in the spring. We haven't had them in the summer. We've had a lot of success in areas that we were told that we never would. Might be a good opportunity to just kind of talk about again, why are we seeing the nets still in the river in the fall? Could you kind of give not really a highlight, but just maybe another recap of why we're seeing them in the fall, and what we should be expecting as part of that harvest reform?
Sure. Well, I guess certainly the plan that's been in place, as you referenced, for a while has had no gill nets other than a very small asterisk thing they did last year in the spring, but no spring gill netting, no summer gill netting in the main stem. And frankly, I want to make it very, very clear that the gill net fleet has been catching record numbers of Chinook in the off channel areas. So this is not there's no reason for a pity party here. The gill net fleet landed over 10,000 Chinook in the off channel areas which was largely spring and into the summer. They did very well, whereas and because the run didn't come back, and what I already mentioned with the early closure, we did not do very well in either the spring or the summer. So it's really about honoring that plan, and the economics have been certainly met on the spring and the summer. The fall has always been a challenge under the plan, and that's exactly why the buyback was so important, because the buyback was intended to buy back those impacts. We are still impacting stocks with those fall fisheries. B-run steelhead, for example, is a limiting stock many times. Tules is a limiting stock that we see, Snake River Wild. So it's really about implementing that buyback on the Washington side and reserving those impacts. Should be the first step towards reducing main stem gill netting, which was always to eventually removing them from the main stem was always, the intent of this. So I guess stay tuned on the implementation of this buyback, because certainly if the WDFW follows the intent here, they should be reserving significant amount of the harvest, because a lot of the gill netters sold their licenses and that had active landings, and then they went out and played games and bought licenses that didn't have landings associated with them. So again, if we do what was intended here, it should have a significant impact moving forward.
Fingers crossed. Hey, how about can we talk about why we would see a closure and still see gill nets in the river? I know that was extremely sensitive last year, but can you kind of talk about the priority and when you meet the end of one and still see another occurring?
Well, I can give you the fish wonk what the departments would tell you. My personal answer is I don't really like it any more than anybody else does. It doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, so I'll tell you what they're going to say. I'll tell you what the preseason plan called for. But does that mean it's a good thing? I don't think so. So anyways, I think the answer is when we get into preseason planning, there are allocations of available impacts that are given to both sectors, sports, commercial. We then divvy up the recreational between Buoy 10 and Warrior Rock and so forth in the fall. And then, the commercials have their allocation, which is certainly smaller than it was. I want to make that very, very clear. It's limited to the fall, and you'll see they do everything they can to avoid tules. So that's why they fish in zones 4 and 5, in the fall, earlier in the fall season. And then as we get into this time of year, we're seeing these small mesh aka tangle gill nets, that are in the river. We're primarily targeting hatchery coho, but so they're waiting later in the season. But I will say the compact is meeting this week again. I really hope that the recreational fishery is kept open. We have large numbers of upriver brights crossing Bonneville Dam. It's a good return. Certainly where we have cases of these coho coming back at Buoy 10, other places, there's people that have been still doing pretty well out there. And where we have, I think the one thing I want to make very clear is that, as we have made some significant sacrifices going mark select more than in previous years at Buoy 10, for example. And that, comes with pain. That's not loved. It does extend seasons. And the thing we need to remember and be proud of is recreational anglers. We're doing a service in many ways with that mark selected fishery to target those hatchery coho, to target, hatchery Chinook, release the wild ones. And that's really what we need. We as a collective, all fishers, need to be doing more of if we're serious about recovering wild fish, maintaining, heck, maybe even increasing hatchery production. That's just what we're going to have to do.
You touched on it for a moment where you mentioned that the commercial fishermen are really trying to avoid that Thule stock. And it's important that we as sports fishermen remember, that Buoy 10 area, it's kind of ripe, with that stock. When you've got that many sports fishermen that are down there, fishing on those waters, certainly there's going to be more impact. And I think that it has that negative impact that we certainly don't like. So with the nets going upriver to those zones that you'd mentioned, certainly much less likely to see a Thule stock that's going to get up there. So it's not going to expedite them hitting that quota. So thanks for touching on that.
Yeah, they do. They do impact some of them, but I mean, I guess the hardest thing here is where if we're still going to have, at some point, if you're ever going to have gill netting still in zones 4 and 5, there ought to be recreational harvest that should be open, in that same area, just because of you're past the Thules, and our CCA as well as other organizations last week helped sponsor a legislator fishing event out of Ridgefield. So out there at Warrior Rock, we had legislators from both states that were out there fishing, and just folks, the number of boats out there, any of you have seen it. I mean, what a show for those people to see in terms of the economic benefits and, just the engagement from anglers in a fishery.
No kidding. Hey, group, again, if anyone has any questions, I would ask to raise your hand, and we would love to offer that to Heath.
And the raise hand function, of course, is under reactions, and
yes.
You can toggle to the raise hand for those of you who may not be used to Zoom. So the other issue I'll mention and see as we give people time to come up with questions. There has been some attention on these MOAs, memorandum of agreement, that were adopted by the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission over about the last year, with kind of the Western Oregon non-treaty tribes, so the Silex and some of those. Most recently, the commission very narrowly adopted one for the Grand Ronde tribe, and these, honestly, I mean, many of you are aware of Oregon history. I mean, a lot of these tribes were once recognized, treaty tribes, and then with reservations, and different things happen in history, and many look at it pretty unfair, and these tribes lost that status. There was attempts to kind of give them reservations back, but they didn't have the treaty rights treaty fishing rights that some of the other tribes did. So former Governor Brown made this a priority, working with her commission to try to create an opportunity for those tribes to work closer with ODF and W. I won't call it co-management, it isn't, but to work with them in a productive way, to look for fishing opportunity, increase the resource, things like that. there are some concerns that we as sportsmen should have about these agreements, just to make sure that they don't come at a cost, for fishing opportunity, and that are done in open and transparent manner, that they can be changed later. So there are some concerns, but most recently with the Grand Ronde, the 4 treaty tribes, so the Yakima, the Umatilla, the Nez Perce, and Warm Springs, were not pleased at all, because they believe they had usual and accustomed type fishing areas in the Willamette below Bonneville Dam. And so when the commission adopted that MOA, they are threatening to potentially sue to assert their rights to fish below Bonneville Dam. And I think the position we have taken is just some real concern that if that could happen, it could have seismic effect on fisheries below Bonneville Dam, in the Willamette River, and so forth. So I think we're really urging everyone to be very cautious proceeding forward in this, because the compared to Washington and compared to Puget Sound, the co-management relationship in the Columbia River is a whole lot better in terms of the 2 states working with the treaty tribes than it is in the to the north of you. So just it ain't perfect. Nothing's perfect in life, but we just don't want to see that go in a very negative way.
You mentioned the Washington Commission. It was only a short time ago that it was pretty clear that the Oregon and Washington Commission were very much out of alignment with how they felt that it should be managed. What is that relationship in the current day? Are they working well? Are they still at odds?
Yeah, the commissioner who probably drove that wedge is gone. The commissioner in Washington, I won't go into names, but he is no longer on the commission. So I think there's definitely an opportunity to hopefully get back into alignment, get back into concurrence. But they don't seem in a very big hurry to do so. And that's the really frustrating thing, when we're basically paying, the recreational sector is really paying the price, in particular in the spring, with this lack of concurrency, and no one seems in a very big hurry to address it. So I think that's a concern, but there have been some new commission appointments made in Washington that are certainly, I think, more favorable to conservation. I think they're favorable to selective harvest. There's, if you follow the news, there certainly are concerns from in the hunting community. There have been expressed about, where the commission comes down on certain issues there. But I think it's a commission we can work with. We are working with in Washington, but we need to see a little more expedience to get to, concurrence here, and for them to make a clear, affirmative guidance on those impacts we talked about earlier from the buyback.
No, that's great news. Outstanding. Barbed hooks, barbless hooks. I still hear the occasional gripe, and CCA is largely being pointed at as to why that exists, and don't think that that's fair. But there's a bright side. I mean, there was certainly a positive that has come out of that agreement. Can you talk about kind of that life cycle of what led us to using a barbless hook, and then also I know that there was legislation that was passed, I think it was 2 years ago, the poison pill, where we're able to hold them accountable to make sure that money was being used appropriately. Could you kind of break that down?
Sure. Well, definitely, we'll start with lovely barbless hooks. So this was the move to barbless hooks in the Columbia stems back to the 2012 era, when the Kitzhaber gillnet reforms were adopted by the Oregon Commission. And I can't, certainly wasn't a CCA idea. We love barbless hooks, and all of our members are gonna, really love barbless hooks. And so we never supported it. It was something the Washington Commission at the time brought to the table, I think partly based on their experience in Puget Sound, where barbless hooks is very common in terms of being used. And I think the idea was a good one, which is, it sounds good is what I'm saying in terms of, oh, well, barbless hooks, how make our fisheries more selective, less mortality. The issue is there's just not a lot of science to support that. It really has a lot more to do about hooking location than it does barb or barbless in terms of release survival. So that's how we got there. Whether, as we talked about, a lot of these things could be changed, and they have been changed. We aren't dealing with the full set of reforms that were supposed to happen in 2012, so nothing is forever. I think we as sportsmen always need to take the high road. And I think we do this every time, and we can be very proud of it, to say that we're willing to do, the best absolute thing we can do for the fish. But I expect this is going to continue to get, looked at and considered in terms of the science. So that's that. And then the other issue you mentioned was, of course, part of the 2012 reforms was the inclusion of the endorsement, the Columbia River salmon endorsement that everyone needs to pay in Oregon to fish in the Columbia River Basin. And that generated revenue to partially implement the reforms, including increased hatchery production in those off-channel areas. We just got done talking about 10,000 Chinook harvest levels. So some of that money is going to that. Some of the money is going to other things. What happened in about 3 years ago now is that endorsement was up for reauthorization, and it needed to be legislatively. And seeing what was going on in Washington with the continual unraveling of the gillnet reforms, we worked in that session to amend that reauthorization bill to essentially say, if you increase the areas where gillnets can be used compared to what they've been, and we talked about that earlier, or you reduce the opportunity for, the allocation for the recreational sector, the endorsement will go away. And so that's what that language said, and it is, I do believe, and very strongly, it has helped to, hold back the dam of what we were dealing with a Washington Commission that was very adversarial towards these reforms. Having that provision in there, I think, helped in Oregon significantly. That endorsement, I don't have it right in front of me. I think it sunsets again in 2025. So it's amazing how the years tick by. We all get gray, you know how it goes, but we're going to be back talking about that endorsement again in a couple of years. So Sean Miller, our lobbyist in Salem, we'll be back at it again as we are engaging in that.
Yeah, that was a wild pitch on my part. So thanks for catching that and pulling that in and bringing those together. So
no.
Definitely positives. Right on. Well, hey, group, we're still looking for any questions that you'd have for Heath. Anybody have anything they'd like to bring up? All right, a question from Les Faley. Please, why we care so much about the Thule stock? It's not a very edible upon return.
Yeah, well, I feel I get it. No one ever really wants them, so that's the funny thing. I mean, I'm happy to release that thing. Well, we care about it because it's an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act, and most of our fisheries in the Columbia River are managed on impacts, largely targeting stocks that aren't the constraining stock. So in this case, a Thule is really a constraining stock when we get in the river. And we're trying to avoid them and to target and harvest as many healthy upriver bright Chinook as we can. I think we also care about them because, boy, wouldn't it be nice to see some more recovery of that stock so we could actually have less of a constraint on our fisheries in the river. And while in river anglers might not be very interested in Thules, they are the backbone of the Washington coastal fishery. So the coastal troll, commercial commercial troll fishery, as well as the charter fishery off the coast. So and as well as you go north, up the Pacific. So those commercial impacts are significant on Thule's, because the impact we have is pretty relatively small, slice of the overall 38% allowable exploitation rate on that stock. So it kind of gets back to that need for continued look at harvest reform out in the ocean if we're going to get increased abundance of wild Thule's back, to make more progress towards recovery. So I hope that answers the question. I see some hands up. I'll let you pick them there.
Hey,
Wade.
Ken, go ahead.
Who are you?
I had to unmute myself. Sorry I was late to the party. I was on the Columbia losing a Chinook on a barbless hook. I did, however, release 2 beautiful native silvers. I had a lot of people drive by me because they saw my hat and they asked me if I knew if they were extending the season on the Columbia. Did you cover that, Heath? Is there a meeting soon? I understand there's a meeting to discuss this.
Yeah, there's a compact meeting tomorrow or the next day. It's this week. I mean, look, I got the notice, so I don't know yet whether they're going to extend it. I kind of covered this earlier, and we are hopeful that it would remain open, given the returns that we're seeing, and given, really what this means in many ways is that some of the constraints, I'll use that word, the reduced fishing opportunity that was implemented out at Buoy 10, with the closure times, mark selective fisheries, did result in a reduction of the impacts of that fishery, which has allowed really this Warrior Rock fishery to be what it is right now. But we very much hope to see it will be kept open, and hope to know more soon.
Thanks.
Les, I see you've got your arm up.
Hey, Heath. It seems as though Dave Moskowitz and the native fish proponents are really pushing some what I assume are newer studies, saying that hatchery fish are bad to mix with native fish, et cetera, et cetera. And with the study that the governors are asking that you mentioned at the first of the program, is CCA or Hatchery and Wild doing anything to kind of counter Moskowitz propaganda?
Well, Don New isn't on the line, but certainly Hatchery and Wild is. I mean, they're very active in terms of spreading that message that we can, in fact, have hatcheries and wild fish together. They're not mutually exclusive. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have to watch very closely the third-party review of the hatchery system. And the other thing, the thing that always just either drives me crazy, but it's like why I like getting up every day, is how complicated and interrelated all this stuff is. And so let's say you could implement what these folks are calling for, and we'll just go ahead and shut down the hatcheries. Well, if we still have the harvest, that is going to be a ticket to nowhere for a lot of these stocks. So, I mean, really, we have to really look at this in a comprehensive manner. Yes, we need to reform harvest in terms of out in the ocean. Really need to see more selective harvest practices, and that will in turn help us on the hatchery piece when you have these concerns about too many hatchery fish returning to wild spawning grounds. There's really only 2 ways to deal with that: reduce the production, but that doesn't really help a lot when you still got fisheries out harvesting the wild fish, or transition to more selective fishing practices. And so that's what we continue to advocate as a solution.
All right, thanks for that.
Thanks, Heath.
Hey, a question. We went back to the Thule's that's in our chat. Why don't we change our hatcheries to eliminate Thule production, shift over to other, Chinook?
A great question. I think it ties right back to what I mentioned, who tends to like the Thule's so much right now, in terms of it being the backbone of the coastal ocean fishery. And so for many years, they have worked hard to try to maintain that production and actually restore it after there have been reductions. So there have been reductions in tule production or hatchery production over the last 5 to 6 years. That was as a condition of NOAA's approval of biological opinions for the hatchery production. So I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there have been some significant reductions, and they have said if you don't make progress towards this fancy 4-letter acronym called PHOS, proportion of hatchery origin spawners, the proportion of hatchery origin spawners that are on the spawning grounds, we're going to have to further reduce production, and that maybe is what's going to happen. And so, to the listener, the question there, that is something that could happen. We have worked, a lot of the tule production is in Washington, not Oregon, nearly all of it, so, for example, we've worked in the Cowlitz River, a major tributary to the Columbia, to try to increase spring Chinook production there, certainly with some of the limited capacity they have at the hatcheries, and perhaps if that meant a reduction in tule production, then that certainly was possible. But I think it's a great question, and but it all goes right back to the ocean and what goes on out there as well.
Right. Fantastic. Any other questions for Heath? No, it's already been 45 minutes. Any closing thoughts?
Wade, I'll mention to folks that I mentioned that there was this legislator fishing day last week that CCA was involved with other organizations to help sponsor, and I just want to encourage everyone here to not be shy, to reach out to your elected officials. We can help with kind of information there, if nothing else, to let them know how much you enjoy recreational fishing, how much it means to you, how it changes how you think about our elected officials, and you can go to the great lengths that you as a recreational angler go to conserve the resource. So I think that's a great message. If we could just continue instilling that in these elected officials, that'll be helpful to us when we get into these debates in Salem, or we get in Olympia, or wherever it might be.
Thank you. On that note, there was a question from Les. Does CCA work with other groups? Can you touch on kind of what some of our partnerships may be and what those look like?
Yeah, so I just mentioned there's a group here that's National Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation. That is something CCA is active in. They have kind of state level, I'll call them caucuses, but state level organizations that bring sportsmen's groups together to work in the state capitals with legislators. I think that's a great model, great organization that they helped sponsor and pull together that legislator fishing day. So that was great. And we will work with anyone when our interests align and where there's commonality. And we have worked with groups that we don't see eye to eye on hatcheries. I'll just be very frank with that. And it's kind of like you agree to disagree on that. And we have found areas where we have common agreement, and we do have common agreement in many instances on the need to move to selective harvest and move away from non-selective gill nets in the main stem Columbia River. And so we have worked cooperatively with those folks on that. And, certainly we understand their kind of where they're coming from on the hatchery side of things, but it's just not what we, certainly where we're coming from and what we've seen in terms of our experiences.
Somebody is off mute. Okay. Well, Heath, I mean, you've shown tonight, there's so much work that's being done kind of behind the scenes. It's not always going to be the front page that our members are seeing, but I know that we joined the organization because of these types of efforts that you guys are working on a daily basis. And so I know there's a lot of people on this call very involved. I just incredibly grateful for the work that you do for our organization. So thank you very much. Question from Ken.
Yeah, just a real quick question. And Heath, I started looking at the numbers when they put the nets in a few weeks ago, and then I started looking at historical numbers, and it seems as though every time they put the nets in the water, the number of fish going over Bonneville decreases, and we know that the salmon numbers drop, the coho numbers. Now you can see those and they drop. And interestingly enough, the steelhead numbers drop by about the same percentage. And what are they doing about that? Because they're not allowed to keep the steelhead. So how do we solve that?
Get gill nets out of the main stem Columbia River.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to make it any simpler than that. I could give you all sorts of answers, and we've either tried them or been involved in them, onboard monitoring. I mean, all sorts of things where you can start to get at this. And like it or not, sometimes it feels as though there's a system in place that very much is resistant to any kind of change in that way. So that's one of the reasons why I do believe it's important that we do try to build broad coalitions working on this issue, because if this is the hard part about this issue over the decades, it has always been viewed as a sports angler versus commercial fisher. It's who's quote unquote fighting to kill the last fish. I mean, have you heard this before? And what we need to do is flip that narrative, and how you flip that narrative is you really make it about conservation, about getting B-run steelhead back to the spawning grounds after we're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in salmon recovery in the Columbia River Basin. For example, that study that came out in July that made newspaper headlines, unfortunately, the headlines were, "And hatcheries hurt fish," but this study essentially said, despite spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on Columbia River salmon recovery, we are not making progress on recovering wild salmon stocks. And, the reasons for that are multifaceted, but for me, it has always been harvest is the easiest dial to turn from a cost perspective, a time continuum perspective, and unfortunately, it is the thing that the people are most resistant to turn. Meanwhile, I saw the question come in the chat about the Snake River dams, and I think it's a great segue to that. There's no doubt that dams kill fish, and large numbers of fish, certainly in the Snake River. I'm not belittling all the work that has been done with barging and removable spillway weirs and all those improvements that have happened. As an organization, we have not joined that parade as much, partly because we don't want to make folks think that that's a silver bullet solution to salmon recovery, because we could do that and then continue doing the harvest as usual, our business as usual in the harvest space, and not make the kind of progress that we ought to, while coming at a great cost, obviously, which the dams would. Now, there's more momentum than ever before on the Snake River Dam issue, so we'll have to see, how that unfolds. And certainly, we know, based on kind of the numbers, that they are having a pretty significant impact on some of those stocks.
Thank you. Hey, I don't know if you see this next question that's come in. I've heard that before. Do we have a response or something that you could share?
You talking about the legislation, gill nets, main stem?
Yeah. Do we need to have legislation to eliminate gill nets altogether on the main stem?
Maybe. I mean, yes. I mean, ultimately, I think you will need legislation to do that. It is not easy to do. Passing ballot measures is not easy to do either. And there is the gill net issue is a lot more complicated and bigger than just the non-tribal side of this too. And there are. So I think what we've tried to do is to transition away from gill nets, but not, do everything we can not to demonize the gill net to the extent that we can do that, because of some of the other audiences that might be listening to that, who have significant political and societal power certainly in this day and age. So I think that's something we all have to be careful about, like really not try to vilify things and be against them, and try as much as we possibly can to be for things. I think it gives us hopefully more winsome arguments moving forward.
And I would encourage the person that asked that question. We do have a great section on the CCAOregon.org webpage that really talks about that ballot measure history and kind of what led us to where we were at, some of the obstacles that were faced. It's very complicated, very complex, as you shared. So I would definitely encourage anyone to go take a look and read through what we've got out there. Hey, I want to be respectful of your time. I know that we are almost to the bottom of the hour, and we need to get you out for your daughter's soccer game. Couple things. I wanted to recognize Pat Hogan. We've got Pat on the call. Pat being the editor of Salmon Steelhead Journal, fantastic magazine. Pat has been our biggest champion since day one. I've had some incredible write-ups with what we've done, some of our successes, where we're trying to go. So welcome, Pat. Would love to give you a second if there's anything that you wanted to share for our group. Not to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine, Wade. Thanks. I'm just here to listen to Heath and kind of get a better understanding of what he is working on and the issues that CCA is working on. And it's just it's comforting to know that someone like Heath and Sean too are working for us. And so that's as much as I'd like to say, but thanks for that, and thanks for the shout out. And it's nice to finally see your face, Wade. I see your renewals coming in all the time.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
Love magazine. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Does anyone else have anything? We do have our annual trivia question. It's going to be a Coast headlamp that we're going to give away. A lot of people I know are going to know this question. But before we close, anything else? Okay. I know this answer is going to come through right away. So the trivia question is this. CCA was created in 1977 by 14 riled up sports fishermen. What was the original fisheries calamity that brought these anglers together? First person to put the answer into the chat will receive that headlamp. So again, what was the original fisheries calamity that brought these 14 fishermen together back in 1977? And Pat knocks it right out of the cart. Okay, so it was the decimation of the redfish and the speckled trout. Drastic commercial overfishing along the Texas coast had decimated redfish and the speckled trout populations. 4 years later, 1981, gill nets along the Texas coast were outlawed, and both the red drum and speckled trout were declared game fish, so a major victory. Pat, we'll get you a headlamp set out. So thank you very much. Want to pause? Jack, Ken, anything that you guys would like to share for the organization before we wrap up? Okay.
When you said Ken, are you talking about Ken and Mary, Ken, or me?
Yeah, I apologize, Ken and Mary. Yeah. But Ken, if there's anything that you'd like to share,
well, no, I'd like to thank Ken and Mary as usual.
Yeah, and if you're asking me, it's like I just with that question.
Over the hump on Saturday, we had a great Portland, and we owe it to Ken and Mary for all of their work again.
No doubt.
So
the golf tournament went well.
Oh, we had a time. We made a pretty good chunk of money this year, and everybody had fun. So I guess that's all you can hope for. I see Ken and Mary are ready to.
Yep, Ken and Mary, you've got your hand up.
So I saw a question pop up about Oregon's executive director. And a week or so ago, we interviewed 2 candidates. The committee recommended one of those, and it's gone off to national. They're doing a background, and we hope to have that person named about September 17th.
Oh, fantastic.
So
That's
they
a
were
great
both
update.
good candidates, by the way. So
That's a great update. Thanks, Ken. And then Jack, I heard you were starting to share something as well.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say that the stuff that went on with the stuff that went on in Texas and why they were successful was the model that CCA follows, and that's why we follow that model here. That they've been at it longer than we have. They agreed to let us be one of their chapters, and following that model will make us successful also.
True statement. Thanks, Jack. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining. It's been a great meeting. Again, Heath, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Wonderful information, and we're going to get this saved and published out to our YouTube channel. Again, we have this meeting the second Tuesday of every month. Normally we're meeting at 6:30. We made an adjustment just this month, but we look forward to seeing you at 6:30 next month. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heath.